Hi, everyone. Welcome to this series where we are doing consultations with different therapists and the documentation struggles or questions that they may have. And most of these are really common things that a lot of people have. So they were brave enough to volunteer and be the guinea pig, so to speak. So today we have Gina Della Penna, who is a licensed mental health counselor in New York. Hi, Gina.
Hi, Melissa. I'm so glad to be here.
Yes. So Gina, why don't you introduce yourself real quick? Tell us a little bit about your practice and what you do.
Sure. I have a part-time private practice in Garden City, New York, here on Long Island, and I work with adolescents and adults, basically with issues like anxiety, depression, life transitions, grief, relationships, things like that. And it's a relatively new practice. It started back in July of 2016. So I'm just coming up on my year anniversary and I'm loving every minute of it.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
And do you do any insurance or do you do any super bills?
Yeah, so I don't accept insurance as payment, but I'd say maybe close to half of my clients do take the super bills that I create for them after they pay me, and they submit it to insurance, and they'll get most of the time they'll get some reimbursement of the payments that they give to me.
Cool. Okay, because we are going to talk about notes today, so that can have an impact on that.
Sure.
Awesome. So the reason that that you proposed doing a consultation was, that you've had a pattern of maybe getting a little bit behind in notes and then catching up and then getting behind. And there are usually things that are recurring when that happens. This is a really common scenario for everyone out there. Very, very common scenario I hear all the time. So you are not alone in this at all. But why don't you talk a little bit about, what's been going on and what prompted you to reach out when I asked people for volunteers?
Yeah, sure. So yes, I have been struggling a little bit with keeping up with my notes. I take notes at every session during my session, but then I want to be able to put in clear and concise progress notes into my EHR and keep that going. And with it being a new practice and dealing with, client calls and research between sessions and trainings and, all the fun stuff that goes along with private practice, the notes kind of get pushed down on my list. And I think part of the reason why I push it down is I feel like I do need some clarity about what exactly needs to be in my notes. Having a private practice with self-pay only. In the past, I've worked in various settings, in group practices, in hospitals, college campus, and there were different ways of keeping notes based on who might be reading them or if they might be audited by an insurance company. And being in a self-pay private practice, I kind of struggle with what exactly needs to be in the note that would benefit my clients. So I don't want to write too much or too little in the progress note. And of course, ethically, what is the right thing to do, on my part, my liability and all of that. So I think that if I felt a little bit firmer in that, then I would feel a little bit more relaxed and calmer about my notes, and I think they would go up on my priority list instead of kind of pushing them to the side when I feel a little overwhelmed.
Yeah, for sure. If it feels like an overwhelming task or something that takes a lot of energy, then it's that much harder to push yourself to get it done. And then if it grows, then it's that much harder.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. And sometimes I'll take little notes to remind myself of things. So a couple of things kind of popped out, which is, do you have any structure for how you write your notes on a regular basis?
Yeah, so in my EHR, I use Simple Practice. I use their standard notes. So some of it is clicking, check off boxes, and some of it is writing in, more descriptive sections. So that's what I normally use right now. I'm thinking about at some point changing the format, but that's what I've been going with for now.
And does it work pretty well?
It's not too bad. Yeah, it works pretty well. I feel like it's, hitting what it needs to hit. But again, sometimes in the descriptive boxes, I worry that I'm putting too much information or maybe not enough. So I don't, I think that's where my uncertainty is.
What are the descriptive boxes? Like, do they have a title, or is there a particular thing you typically put in there?
Yeah, can't think off of the top of my head what they are.
And if it's just the check boxes, we don't have to worry about that.
Yeah.
But are there things that you tend to like feel like you have to write in? Like maybe like the client's presentation or quotes that they had, or are
Yeah,
there pieces that you feel are missing a lot of the time?
I guess I wish I had the printout of the standard note in front of me. I feel like that might be helpful, but I guess, at the very beginning when you're talking about, I can't remember what the name of each section is, but at the very beginning when you're sort of talking about the session, and then the interventions are fine, like that's where there's a lot of check boxes and they're usually interventions, and when it's not, I add in what I might be doing that might not be an option. And then at the end, I guess, where you're sort of talking about next steps and all of that. So
Okay.
that might be where I also have a little bit of an issue, too much or not enough.
That's actually really helpful. I think we
Yeah.
can simplify that process a little bit.
Okay.
And then as far as writing your notes, do you have like a schedule, like a time where you always write your notes, or a time where you always do administrative stuff in the office?
I really don't, and that's probably something that I need to do. A lot of the time, it's sort of something that's hanging over my head, and it might be at the end of the day where I sit down to do it, and then I'm just really tired by that point. So sometimes I'll force myself to push out a few, say, okay, I will do 5 and then go to bed, kind of a thing. And I am trying to plan out my schedule moving forward in the future, where I carve out like a specified amount of time, or a certain day or certain hours where I'm sort of getting it all done. I do tend to see clients back to back.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't have that extra few minutes to write the note. And I also feel like I sort of need those extra few minutes when I do have them to kind of like recenter and be fresh for my next client, even if it's just 10 minutes. So I would rather be doing that between my clients rather than writing up the note on my laptop.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And I definitely understand that, needing that space. So even if, I do recommend people a lot of times when they get behind on their notes,
Yeah.
there are also people who tend to go over in session and like let people go to like 55 minutes or like right up until the next time. And
Yeah.
So trying to create that structure around like having a set end time
Mm-hmm.
is one of the easiest, maybe not easy per se, but it's one of the quickest things you can do. Like you can start doing that tomorrow, right?
Right.
So that's one of the easiest things to implement, because when you do feel refreshed after seeing 5 people straight in a row because you've taken that time, then you're a lot more likely to be able to do even just a couple of notes before you leave.
Yeah. Yes.
So that's one thing I would definitely recommend.
Okay.
And times when you have been like on top of your notes, when were you typically doing them?
Sometimes I will have like a longer gap between clients, so I might be able to get a few notes done there, That's nice when it happens. I guess I've been a little bit more flexible with my schedule and with my clients. Maybe that's a to-do thing moving forward, getting a little bit more structured with how I'm scheduling my clients, and maybe I build in gaps of longer periods of time between my clients so that I can get notes done, you know, in the midst of my workday?
Yeah, I know a lot of times it's hard because, you know, it might be like that 3 to 8 o'clock time is so precious for all of us
Yes.
because everybody wants those
Totally.
spots.
Yeah.
And so nobody's realistically going to be like, nope, I'm not going to schedule anyone from 5 to 6 because I'm going to take a break for notes, right? Like if a client wants to come in at 5, you're probably going to schedule them. Um, so that's one thing. Whenever we're creating like schedules, we want to be realistic about it. So that's realistic for most of us who are therapists. But then that means a lot of us are ending our days later too. And then it makes it difficult to like stay there and get your notes done.
That's right. Like you just want to leave the office and go home at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are different camps of thought about that. Like some people say like you should not leave the office until your notes are done. I don't necessarily agree with that. I do know that the sooner you get your note done, the better it's going to be.
Yes.
I mean, I've reviewed enough people's notes that I can almost tell when they've written their notes late, and I can tell when they've done it right away, and it's pretty obvious. And then I know myself writing notes, it's much easier to do it, you know, if it's right after or like within a few hours than it is even to do it the next day. And it's much easier to do it the next day than it is to do it a week later. Right?
Sure.
So for me, it's nearly impossible to do it a week later. And actually for a lot of people. But so that's one thing I would really prioritize is getting a schedule going for your notes.
Yeah.
So making sure that even if it's the next day, you know, and you have simple practice, which means you can even dictate your notes on your phone. You can, you know, be at home on your computer and write your notes. So you have some flexibility. It's not like you have to go back to the office to do them.
Yeah.
So I would definitely make it a priority and almost, it's sort of like creating a policy for yourself, right? So you think about if you were ever going to hire somebody to work for you, that's something you'd have to provide expectations around, right? Because you wouldn't want someone who's working for you to not have their notes done for a week or 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So you want to create like a policy for your practice, which is maybe like within 24 hours, all notes will be done within 24 hours of the session. So then if you try to stick to your own policy, then you can schedule maybe like, you know, if you have a heavy day one day, the next day you have to schedule 90 minutes for doing notes in the morning or during lunchtime or whenever those off times are for clients when you're not seeing clients. So that way you're setting yourself up because it's at a time when it will get done. Because you're not trying to force it at the end of the day. You're not trying to force it in between clients. But then you do still have to hold yourself to it.
Yeah. Hold myself accountable.
Yes. Yes. And how many clients do you usually see in a week?
You know, maybe around 15.
Okay. Yeah. And so for most people, it's around 10 minutes to write a note. For a lot of people, it can be faster. And for some people, it takes a little bit longer. So it just depends. But 10 minutes is kind of a safe place to plan. So that's another thing is you want to think, okay, realistically, if I have 15 clients a week, that's 150 minutes of notes a week. So that's 2.5 hours.
Wow. I never thought of it that way.
Yeah.
But that's a great way to plan for it.
Yeah, exactly. So you know you need at least 2.5 hours a week of doing notes.
Yes.
And the mistake a lot of people will make is they might plan for administrative stuff, but then they spend it doing all that other stuff you were talking about at the beginning, right? Because there's so many things.
Yeah.
And some people would even rather do their accounting or their bookkeeping than
exactly.
write their notes.
Yeah, like I have a marketing background, so I would much rather do the fun marketing stuff for me than the note stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and 2.5 hours can seem like a lot, but when you consider, you know, that's for 15 hours of client work, it's really pretty reasonable.
Yes.
And if you're on top of it, it's probably a little bit less. You know, for a lot of people, they can get their notes down to closer to 5 minutes if they're doing them pretty consistently.
Yes. Okay.
So that would be I would say the first thing is make sure you have a schedule.
Yes.
Where you are scheduling at least 2.5 hours a week to do notes, and it's only notes time.
Yeah, that's helpful to think of it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then that's kind of like the structure part of it.
Mm-hmm.
The other part of it is what you were saying, which is, so you sit down to write your note, like, even if you have the schedule, and then it's a very uncomfortable process, which is what leads to the procrastination, right?
Very uncomfortable.
Yeah. And that's so common. I hear so many people say, like, I don't know what to write, or how much, or too little.
Yes.
So would you mind sharing a little bit about, because this is so common and that's what people say is, I don't know what is too much to write. I don't want to overshare, but I don't want to not put in enough.
Right.
So would you mind talking a little bit more about what are the fears or concerns around both of those areas?
I guess, like when I'm thinking about a client and let's say the client is having a relationship issue and, they're going into all the details of it and you're there in the trenches with them, stepping back and then writing the note about that, in a very sort of top line way where you're sort of addressing the essence of what it is, but not getting down and dirty with it either. I think that's something that I struggle with. And yeah, I would say something like that. So that might be an example.
And what type of harm do you envision potentially doing to your client?
I guess, I don't want to go into like tons of detail so that if somebody were reading the note, let's say the client asked for the note, or for some reason courts would ask for the note, because I can't envision too many other scenarios where, my notes would be read by somebody else. I obviously don't have to turn them over to be audited by insurance companies since I'm not accepting insurance. And I don't have any management or anything like that administrators to have to, look over my notes in any way. So I guess, if my clients ever requested notes or a court requested notes, I would not want to give too much detail where it would make my client feel uncomfortable or expose a little bit too much than is necessary.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the most common fear. And so with that, I would say one thing that can be helpful is think about the session and sort of like a summary. So what generally did we talk about? So sometimes you talk with clients about multiple things that happened, right? Like you might talk about things that are somewhat related and they might be fairly different. And sometimes like one event from the week dominates the entire session, or
Right.
one thing, so regardless of whether either is the case, you're sort of providing like the high level view of what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to use terms that don't shy away from describing the situation, but are not descriptive of the details.
Right.
So what an example would be, so for example, let's say you're seeing a client as an individual and they're having an affair, and they're seeing you because they're struggling with feeling a little bit guilty about the affair. They're not in a place where they want to tell their spouse, but they don't necessarily want to get divorced, right? So they're working through these things because they're trying to figure out this problem. So for that, it's perfectly fine to describe the fact that the client is having an affair, because that is pretty central to the understanding of the case, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be a dominating theme in the treatment and probably in almost every session. However, you wouldn't want to describe like who the affair is with.
Sure.
So, a lot of times that can actually be more difficult than people think, because sometimes that is significant who the affair is with, right? If it's like one of the spouse's really good friends, or a coworker or something like that. So you want to just stick with general terms like coworker is fine. You don't have to say boss or manager or employee. You know, just saying coworker captures all the possible themes that could come up with that and possible conflict. That could be a big deal that someone might be in therapy for. Saying, you know, friend of the family can, you know, doesn't point out to who it would be, but it explains how the situation would be more complicated, right? And not having that amount in the note would make it pretty difficult to write.
Sure, exactly.
But kind of using those like generally descriptive terms often help with wanting to give some of that privacy, but also, you know, not go too in depth. Another way to get over that, if you're really struggling, especially with like a particular scenario or a particular client, is to ask them. So all of our clients should know that we write notes about them. And even if we tell them at the beginning, that's not something that is top of mind for them when they're seeing us, right? So that makes sense and that's fine. But sometimes it might be appropriate to sort of remind them, you know, so when I'm writing notes, you know that I write notes about all of our sessions. You know, I capture what we do, and my goal is to document what's happening, and that's my, ethically I have to do that. So I can't not write notes about what happens. So how do you think you would describe this? How would you like me to reference so-and-so? And so sometimes that can help, and it also can open up a really good clinical discussion.
Yeah, sure.
Because then, you know, you can talk about all kinds of things.
Yes.
And then, of course, there's always the option of actually writing notes with your clients too, which can help. And people are often resistant to do that with very difficult cases, especially.
Yes.
However, in the research on collaborative documentation, that's typically when it's most helpful. When clients say that it's most helpful. So even with clients who, like adolescents who don't want to be in therapy, they will say that writing notes together was more impactful even than other people will say it was. So you can always think of writing notes actually as like an intervention.
Yes.
And sort of like we do with everything, right? If we're really struggling with something with a client, then we sort of take the time to step back and reflect and think, why is this so difficult? You know, with this client in particular, what's going on? And a lot of times it's because we are, you know, reflecting something else that's going on, or there may be countertransference, but it may also simply be that this is how this person presents and this is what other people in their lives are experiencing.
Yes.
And that's something that we can then offer some insight about, or, you know, hopefully help with, and it may give you a different approach with different people.
Yeah. It's a really interesting idea. I've heard of therapists doing that collaborative note writing, and it's something that I've definitely felt resistance towards. But I'd like to learn a little bit more about it and see if that that might help me get them done. I mean, I would imagine that that's great, but also to have that client input could be really interesting in the dynamic of the session.
Yeah, and I think that's what clients tend to find it empowering because they're aware of what's going on. And one thing that's come up in the research is that clients often feel like their therapist secretly thinks they're crazy. And so it opens up, you know, it makes everything transparent.
Yes.
So everyone knows.
Yes.
And so currently, like for myself, I don't currently write the notes like on the computer with the client, but all of my notes are open for everyone to see at any time.
Okay.
So that is something that I'm constantly aware of and thinking about, and I actually consider my notes to be collaborative in that way, because it's sort of like a record for both of us.
Yes.
So Yeah, and I definitely recommend people think about, and sometimes it's easier to write your notes if you think about how you were describing it to your client, rather than sitting there and trying to think about like how you could say it in some jargony way or,
Oh, that's
make
a
it sound
really,
super clinical.
yeah, that's a really, I think that could be a really helpful way of thinking about doing my notes. How would I explain it to the client? I like
Yeah.
that. Yeah, I might try that.
Yeah, because it doesn't have to be very flowery and clinical. I mean, obviously you want to
Yes.
describe what we did, um, but it should be something that's meaningful. Because often when we use that type of language, it doesn't really provide a whole lot of information on what really happened.
Yes.
And the way we would describe it to a layperson gives a lot more emphasis and meaning.
Sure. For sure.
Yeah. Cool. Well, hopefully that helps with sort of how to approach notes a little bit differently.
Yeah.
Um, and what I'll do with this video is sort of link to some sample notes as well, so people can maybe see some examples
That would be great.
of how this might look. Um, and of course, it's kind of difficult to do because, there's as many examples as there are sessions,
Oh my
but
God.
but thinking about maybe those like really specific things that happen, and then how can I describe it in a general term,
Mm-hmm.
but enough that somebody would understand what was still going on.
Yes.
And if the concern is being afraid about the client's privacy, then we have to consider, well, we do have to write notes about what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so then maybe it's that conversation with the client about what level they might be comfortable with, and what is the concern.
Yes.
Um, and our job is just to document what's going on. It's not to, write for a specific person necessarily. And I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of times we do get caught up in that, and we get worried about lawyers reading things, um, and the thing is, you're never going to write a note that's going to make a lawyer happy, um, or or make a lawyer feel that like, oh, there's nothing I can do to try and twist this around. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter what we write, it's going to happen.
Yeah. Good point.
Yeah. So if we stick with the truth, as far as our notes go,
Yeah.
being on the stand is kind of a different story. That's something you talk with Nicole Stoller Peterson about from Therapist Court Prep, but
Mm-hmm.
it's one of my sort of partners in crime. We do a lot of stuff together, but as far as your notes, you're just documenting what happened.
Yes. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. Kind of takes a little bit of that pressure off.
Yeah. And one of the things you said about like the note in simple practice that you do is you're saying like the interventions were pretty easy because you're kind of
Mm-hmm.
just selecting them. And then if there's something that's not in there, you write in what you did.
Right.
So one format or way of thinking about notes might be helpful is called GURP. So that's where, and you don't have to use all the elements of it, but it's goal, intervention, response, and plan. So if the intervention piece is pretty easy for you, then maybe
Yeah.
you think of the note as, okay, start with the interventions. What did I do? And then how did the client respond to each intervention?
Oh,
And then there's your note.
wow. It's kind of cool. So, but then in a GURP kind of a note, you wouldn't have things like symptoms or how they're presenting in the session? And would
You,
that be okay to leave that out?
you could add them in if you really want them in there, but you don't need to have them in there. So what some people do is, and this depends, like if you're billing to insurance, I do recommend that you make some sort of a progress statement
Mm-hmm.
about like how their whatever impairment they're seeing you for, or whatever their diagnosis is, that you make a statement about the fact that they are still impaired and how so,
Yes.
and also how they're making progress towards
Mm-hmm.
that. So that would be one caveat there, that if you're not billing to insurance, you don't necessarily need to worry about that,
Okay.
but it can be helpful. And
Yeah.
maybe that's just, sometimes we do things with clients like ask them to rank things 1 out of 10.
Yes.
Or like I even did this today with a client, like we were working on things and they weren't noticing how much progress they've made over the last few months, right? And so we actually ended up talking about progress just as a therapeutic intervention, right?
Sure.
It wasn't
Yes.
some, thing that, was like, we have to go through this paper. It was, we just started noting all of the things that have changed. And so that's a really simple way to look at it too.
Yes.
And I mean, as far as symptoms, that's not a requirement to have in there.
Got it.
So you don't have to put it in there.
Okay. That's good to know. That's very freeing. But I like that that format that you just described with the interventions. GURP, huh?
Yeah. And you can use the goal or not. It depends on how you do like your treatment planning and talk to clients. But another word would be like problem. Like if they have a common problem, they're coming to see you for.
Yes.
But I think the intervention and response works very well if you use like a checkbox type of format or a template that a lot of the EHRs have built in. And it's kind of an easy way to think about the session, because you just think, okay, what did I do? I did this. So how did they respond to each of those things? Okay. Here's how they responded.
Yes. I like that.
Good. Cool. And that, I think, makes it feel a little less scary, because that's pretty basic, right?
Totally. It makes it a lot less scary. Yeah, for sure.
Cool.
I might have to reevaluate, the structure of my notes.
Yeah.
And see if something else feels a little bit more comfortable.
Yeah. And you play around with things. And if you're trying to figure out like what kind of a template you want to use or what structure, you want to try it out for a couple of weeks.
Yes.
And see if it works. So some people I've worked with have said like, okay, all the clients I see on Monday for the next month, I'm going to use this note template.
Oh, wow.
And so that way they're trying it out with like a couple of different people, and over a period of time, they see how it works. And then you can see what you like better.
I like that. Sometimes the great thing about private practice is all the freedom and choice that you have, but also sometimes that's the most confusing, and so I feel like you gave me permission to kind of be a little bit more flexible with my notes and trying things out and seeing what I like and seeing what I don't like, and not feel so trapped somehow with just one certain set rigid template.
Yeah, because there's so many different things that people use.
Yeah.
And
that there's no right or wrong per se, I think that's the other thing that I kind of can get caught up into.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
And there really isn't. It's about getting them done.
Yes, exactly.
and writing what happened,
Yes.
And I had a thought and I think it left me, but it's as far as that's what it was. As far as structure goes, I would say you do want to have some kind of structure, but you have the flexibility to create whatever you want.
Yeah.
And so you do want to have like a policy, right? Like you do want to say, okay, I'm going to do all my notes within 24 hours. And you do eventually want to decide on like, okay, this is how I'm going to write my notes, simply because it takes less effort. You don't want to sit there and think about the structure of your note every single time. Right. If this is how I write my note, you start thinking about the session in that way. And you'll start thinking about that long term, and then it'll become easier and easier. So that's what systems and structure is supposed to do for us, is actually make things easier. So you don't have to think about it.
Sure. I can totally see how finding a structure that works for a particular therapist, and then doing it over and over again really can cut down on the amount of time that you're actually spending on each note for each client.
Totally. Yeah. Cool. I'm just checking over my notes here. I think we pretty much covered everything. Did you have any other questions about what we've been talking about?
I don't think so. You gave me a lot of new things to think about.
Plenty to do. Yeah. Yeah. So then the next thing would be to just schedule some time to, to do that, and make sure that the first step would be scheduling in that time for notes.
I think so. That's on my to-do list for tomorrow, really taking a look at my calendar and how my week usually looks and figuring out where I can carve out that 2.5 hours of, you know, weekly note time, and nothing else gets squeezed into that. It's just about the notes.
Yeah. Yeah. And it can be helpful to schedule like admin time and note time. And that way, you know, okay, I have time to get the other stuff done and I have time to get my notes done.
Yeah.
And then playing around with it too. You know, I think it's important, especially as we're starting out, you know, you have to figure out what works. And sometimes it's trial and error. And like you said, you have all this flexibility, which is wonderful, but then sometimes it does, you know, bite us in the butt a little bit.
Yeah.
And so figuring out how to balance that. So give yourself some grace in that way and try it
Sure.
out and view it as an experiment.
Yeah, I think so. Both with blocking out that time and the structure of the note. I think that now I feel like I can experiment a little bit more, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, Gina. Well, it's been great talking to you.
Thank you so much for allowing me to do this and allowing me to learn from you. I really appreciate it, and hopefully it will make my note writing a lot easier.
I hope so too, and hopefully for a lot of other people too. I thank
Yes.
you so much for being able to be on video and talk about this stuff. I know that a lot of people are really going to appreciate it.
Oh, I'm glad. Thanks so much, Melissa.
All right, thanks.